Everyday injustice. Too many wrongful convictions. Corruption has infected the criminal justice system, leaving too many people helpless, fighting for their lives. Instead of receiving justice, people suffer. Is that why they say justice is blind?
Today on Everyday Injustice, we have Michael Collins from The Color of Change. Welcome to our show.
Thank you for having me.
So we're going to talk about the recall of Pamela Price in Alameda County. Pamela had been elected in 2022, and now she's out the door in 2024. Not a very long time to settle in there. What are your thoughts on the recall?
I think it's really sad. Honestly, I think that the sort of misinformation and the way that the pro recall campaign ran things, was just kind of like fundamentally dishonest. But we were up against big money, deep pockets, special interests. I think I would be foolish to say there isn't like a kind of nationwide backlash against criminal justice reform, and there certainly is a backlash in California, and she wasn't the only prosecutor to lose that night, or criminal justice reform issue to lose that evening. So, definitely have a sense of sadness about it.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. We saw Chase Bodine recalled in 2022. We saw the same night that George Gascon went down in Los Angeles. Statewide, we saw Prop 36 pass by a really wide margin. And then I think kind of the bellwether of it all was Prop 6, the anti-slavery measure, which had no opposition, got passed in places like Alabama and Tennessee, and it went down.
Yeah, I mean, look, there's no sugarcoating it. I think the results in California were a disaster for people who support criminal justice reform. We can try and find some positivity, but George Gascon, he was one of the faces of the progressive prosecutor movement, and he lost, re-election in Los Angeles to someone who had been a Republican. And then, and obviously, as you mentioned, in Northern California, you have Pamela Price being ousted after less than 2 years in office, and then a number of like statewide initiatives, like the one to increase penalties for minor offences, like that passing with ease. And so there is a sense, especially in California, that, for now, voters are not necessarily buying what the reform movement is selling. And I think we do need to kind of rethink what we're doing a little bit and rethink the path forward. And I don't think we can just kind of necessarily like continue as is. But yeah, I mean, I have a lot of thoughts on what like a path forward might look like, that some people would agree with, some people would disagree with. But I don't think it makes any sense to try and put some sort of positive spin on what happened. There's tons of caveats, especially with Pamela Price. I mean, they wanted to recall her before she even took office, right? We all know that. We know that the recall campaign geared up really quickly after she took office and started gathering signatures. So we know it wasn't, these things are never seriously about public safety or about a concern about somebody, legitimizing crime or coddling criminals or any of the sort of nonsense that we were told. But, at the same time, I do think us in the reform movement, us in the progressive movement, need to kind of, stop and think and take in a little bit what the results of the election were.
Yeah, and it's an interesting point, because one of the things that we saw in 2022 was that Chase Bodine, the recall started before he took office. We saw the same thing down in LA, and now we see the same thing in Alameda with Pamela Price. It seems like they have a template now as to how to run against folks that are trying to reform the criminal legal system. What do we do about that?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think we are probably set for, a spell in the wilderness, like nationally. But, I think about, there's a couple of things I think about with respect to like California and the results. I think that you know, California is sometimes seen as this like very progressive state, and you know, a lot of like progressive leadership and liberals and the bastion of like, you know, American liberalism. But I think when you sort of dig beneath the surface, you know, it was a state that had Arnold Schwarzenegger in charge not that long ago and has had some fairly like tough on crime prosecutors across the state. And you know, you have all the sort of tech bros in San Francisco who have like, there's a lot of like NIMBYism in California, perhaps more so than other jurisdictions. And I think all that means that you have this kind of like dichotomy that I think we've seen across, you know, the criminal justice reform movement, but especially with progressive prosecutors, where, you know, for conservatives, right, they're pretty transparent about how they feel about these issues. They don't really care about people of color. They don't care about racial disparities. They don't care about police brutality, police misconduct. So they're not going to vote for it. You have this strange situation with liberals where they will put the yard sign saying, you know, no more drug war, or let's end mass incarceration, and they'll watch the Netflix documentaries and they'll donate to ACLU, and they'll sort of, you know, put Black Lives Matter on their Facebook page and stuff like that. I think the challenge comes when they are asked to sort of, when we try and implement policies that do right the wrongs of the past, they don't want anything to upset, you know, their lifestyle, right? And the reality is, like, what we're trying to do as a movement, you know, when we decline to prosecute low-level offences, for example, you are possibly going to see more visible signs of poverty, right? You are possibly going to see, you know, more visible signs of drug use. You're going to see more visible signs of homelessness, that sort of thing. We're not going to be relying on the police to just kind of pick people up and disappear them. But I think the hard thing for our movement is liberals actually do like that, right? They do want to, they don't want to see poverty. They don't want to see poor people. They don't want to see drug use. And so, you know, some of the solutions that we have around things like housing and treatment, they are longer term solutions and they're not coercive. And for a lot of people, and I've said this a lot of times, the criminal justice system is like a magic trick. You see somebody doing something that you don't like, you know, whether it's using drugs or being homeless or begging or whatever, and you call 911 and somebody shows up and disappears that person off the street, and you never have to think about them again. Now, whether or not they go to jail or spend a long time in prison or get services, you don't actually care. It's kind of like out of sight, out of mind. And I think one of the things our movement is, you know, has to wrestle with is people actually want that, right? And I think, you know, when you see in California, places like San Francisco and Oakland, it's not necessarily that there has been a big uptick in violent crime. It's more that there's like an uptick in visible poverty, and we haven't quite got services in place to deal with that. Even if we had those services, like I said, they're not going to be coercive. And so people associate, you know, seeing homelessness, seeing drug use with insecurity and a lack of like public safety. And that's when they're like, you know what? I don't actually support this. Get this prosecutor out. Get this, you know, reform in the trash can. Let's go back to like the tough on crime measures. I think California is a stark example of that. And I think it's especially stark because of like the NIMBYism and because California has historically rejected solutions around like homelessness and rejected solutions around like drug treatment. And that's another part of the problem, which is like, if you liberal people will say, you know, we need treatment, not incarceration. Everybody would agree with that. And if you poll people, they'll agree with that. But the polling is sort of, you know, for me, the polling, especially within the reform movement just now, is a form of like denialism, because even though people say on paper, we want treatment, not incarceration, if you open a methadone clinic on their street, they'll go absolutely ballistic and they will oppose it and they will vote out the people who support it. And again, there's just these kind of contradictions that we're trying to wrestle with just now as a movement. And those are some of the things I think we need to like figure out if we're going to figure out a path forward. And this is me like sort of monologuing here, I apologize. I personally feel that as a movement, it sucks not to win, right? But we are right. We have all the evidence behind us. We're not doing this because, we want more, public safety threats on the street. We're doing this because the US has a mass incarceration problem, and that mass incarceration problem is a major civil rights issue. There is no debating that. The fact that we have lost some elections to pass because of the paths we've chosen, the fact that some candidates have been ousted, this is politics. That's what happens. And I think that, like, George W. Bush won re-election in like 2004. It didn't mean that people started supporting like the Iraq War or torture or any of those things. And I think for the criminal justice reform movement, we need to accept that, like, right now we're not winning, especially on the progressive prosecutor side. But that doesn't mean that we'll never win again, or that doesn't mean that we're not right. And I think we should be able to sort of stick to our principles and keep pushing forward. And I think opportunities are going to arise, especially with the Trump administration and the heavy-handed approach that they're likely to take on a number of issues. People will recoil from that and possibly come back into our camp. And it's worth remembering that the progressive prosecutor movement and the widespread protests around police brutality all happened under the first Trump administration. And so there are often like opportunities for progressive change when there's like a, right-wing conservative overreach, as we're likely to see.
Yeah, I want to go back to a point that you had made, though. I'm here repping my UC Davis shirt, and where I live is Davis, California, and it is kind of the stereotypical upper middle class liberal community. It probably voted 80-20, if not more, against Trump in the last election. But it's a thin support. Like, I remember when I first came here, people were supporting Obama and really proud of the first Black president, and had their lawn signs up, but they were opposing things like police oversight commissions, and so there's this weird dichotomy that you got these liberals in terms of national issues, but they don't want the crime near them. This is a notorious slow growth community that's opposed housing. And one of the reasons I think that the community opposes housing is they don't want those other people that are going to create crime. This past week, Davis's city council voted to clear the encampments, right? So, like, they don't want the homeless people up front, but they're not willing to pay to put people into permanent supportive housing, which would actually fix the homeless problem, but take a longer term. I'm a little surprised, though, and San Francisco is kind of the same way, even though it's a bigger city, but I am surprised that Oakland went that way. Like, Oakland is a heavily minority, people of color community, and it seemed like they would be a community that would support reform because they don't want their community members to be mass incarcerated. And even though the numbers were moving in the right direction, in terms of crime was going down after the pandemic, murders went down. Famously, October was a month where there were no murders in the city of Oakland, and then a few weeks later, they threw their DA and mayor out. There's a disconnect going on here.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's hard because I think when I think about like themes coming out of the Trump election, like one of the big themes is like kind of like anti-establishment, right? And candidates who are running on the establishment platform or associated with the status quo are losing. And I think that's true. I think what happened in Oakland with the mayor and also with the DA was just kind of this like anti-incumbency sentiment as well. I do think there was a huge outspending and, PR campaign on the part of the recall folks to blame like everything on Pamela Price and the mayor. And I also think like the role of the media, which has been like, it's just like a really difficult thing to solve, which is like there's a lot of fact-free reporting and vibe reporting about like one side says this, the other side say that, or just like one side says this, and even though it's not true or isn't backed up at all, it kind of carries the day in a way that I think is incredibly like unhelpful. So I don't know. I mean, I can't say like, Auckland, why people, voted the way that they voted, in the numbers that they did. But I mean, those are just like some hypotheses.
Yeah, well, take the issue of retail theft, which, kind of was the driver behind Prop 36. And I think part of the issue behind the recall of Price and the reason why that Gascon lost. The data didn't match the narrative. And I think this is a big problem, right? Because you see these videos of these viral incidents and they're blaming it on Prop 47. They're blaming it on these progressive prosecutors. And it doesn't matter that A, retail theft went up during the pandemic everywhere across the country, regardless of who was the prosecutor, regardless of what the laws were. Didn't matter that California actually has a tougher felony standard than a lot of other states, including Florida and Texas. And it didn't matter that, yes, it's true that retail theft went up during the pandemic, but it also went back down again. And that didn't seem to matter either. And so it was kind of these videos overruled any effort by anyone to kind of fact check this thing. And I don't have a good answer for that. I mean, I've talked to people and they said, well, story, whoever has the most compelling story is going to win. And, I was reading somewhere that, the media has come out with this idea that what we're going to do is we're going to fact check Donald Trump and we're going to fact check all these other things. And in fact, fact checking doesn't really work. What works is having a compelling story. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, look, I think this is what I mentioned before. Like, we have all the evidence on our side, and we have, all the data on our side when it comes to making the case for reform. But that's just hasn't been enough, right? And I sort of like, I applaud the people doing the research and all that stuff. And like, there's reports up the wazoo saying that progressive prosecutors have nothing to do with like increases in crime, etc., etc. But at the end of the day, like we have lost the narrative side of things. Like I think that's where we've got really beaten up. And I think where I go back to is, I think criminal justice reform, policing reform was really like a sort of second tier political issue for much of like the 2010s, where you had this kind of bipartisan movement doing incremental reforms up to and including Donald Trump signing legislation that reduced sentences for people who, sold heroin and crack and so on, something that's kind of unthinkable these days. And then when George Floyd was killed and there was like the outpouring of support and protests and so on and so forth, criminal justice reform and policing really became like a top tier political issue that was talked about in the presidential race and people making commitments and legislation introduced. And then just very quickly, we ran into that kind of 2021 COVID backlash, like the increase in violent crime. And I think we as a movement didn't have a good explanation for the media of like why this was happening. Like we knew it was happening, we saw it was happening, but we didn't know why. And I think that's fair because we genuinely nobody really knew why it was happening. There were all sorts of like hypotheses, but the folks on the right who already hated criminal justice reform were ready with their narrative. It's progressive prosecutors, it's defund the police, it's bail reform. Pretty simple. This is why this is happening, and we just got absolutely crushed. And I think the media, and I hold the media responsible for all of this, they were very gullible in terms of like just printing what folks on the right would say, and police unions and police chiefs and so on, and just the narrative became that these things, defund the police, progressive prosecutors, bail reform, were responsible for violent crime, even
But
though
isn't one of the problems that the right, for whatever reason right now, has the easier narrative to make? Hey, you have a problem, it's this. Whereas the progressives have to like sit down and explain this complicated process.
well, yeah, I
Uh,
mean,
and you can't win that way.
yeah, I mean, it's the old adage of like, if when in politics, if you're explaining, you're losing. And I
Right.
do think like that's why I go back to like, look, some of the data and the research and stuff like that, it's just not resonating with people. The polling as well, like I see a lot of people being like, oh, 80% of people support, criminal justice reform and like all this sort of stuff. And it's like, it's not really helping us win, right? And again, like it's sort of like, I do think we need to get on top of like the narrative side of things. We do need to get on top of like the communication side of things. I don't necessarily have like all the answers, but I do think like, we are set for like a little bit of like a spell in the wilderness while we figure this stuff out. And I think, like for progressive prosecutors, it's like we were this like novelty issue where, it felt like, 2018, you had Krasner, you had Mosby, you had Rachel Rollins, and, felt like we're just going to keep winning and doing all these like day one memos, and then the backlash came, and I think we haven't recovered yet from the backlash. I think you see some prosecutors still getting elected in some places, like Monique Worrell, and like out in Houston as well, and Austin and places like that. You still see reform prosecutors in office and getting elected and re-elected. But by and large, like the movement is being pounded, and now you have like Elon Musk saying that he's going to make it his top priority to oust any remaining progressive prosecutors, and so that's fairly daunting. But yeah, I mean, I think like we've become, the point I wanted to make is like we started off as this like novelty issue, and I think we just have to look at ourselves as like a regular political issue, which is like we will have some good days, we will have some bad days, we'll win some elections, we'll lose some elections, we'll get some laws passed, some laws will be repealed. And right now, from a California perspective, especially, like we're not winning, right? We're just not winning. But I don't think that means that like we abandon what we're doing, or we run away, or we go in completely the other direction, or we try and sort of, you know, win over some of these like tough on crime folks or arguments. I think we just need to kind of like stay true to what we believe in, and hope that like there will be other moments nationally where the public will realize like, oh, this is a big issue. Because the bottom line is, and we know this, if you care about like public safety, the right doesn't have the solutions to that, right? And if you care about public safety and mass incarceration, the right especially do not have solutions to it. The situation is going to get worse, and we're not going to get safer under like Pamela Price's replacement, or, in the same way that San Francisco hasn't got safer under Chesa Boudin's replacement. And I think it's important to us to kind of point out those failings and point out um, the fact that these people have not been able to deliver, and then be ready to kind of pounce with our own solutions.
Yeah. Um, and I think that's an important point, because I feel like even though, I felt like in 2018 to 2020 that the progressives kind of caught the right napping on the issue of progressive prosecutors. That there had been a long time when the ACLU was always coming out with this, oh, prosecutors don't get challenged. Prosecutors, when they do get challenged, don't lose. And that kind of shifted 2018 to 2020. And that kind of caught, I felt like, the right with their pants down. Like they weren't really prepared for that. And then Trump went down in 2020, and it felt like, oh, this gave them a new target to come back after. But on the other hand, even though, things have kind of backslid from the perspective of reform, there's a lot of stuff that's not going to go back to the bad old days either. And so, like, the floor of criminal justice reform, I think, has permanently moved, even if the ceiling and the frontier has backslid a little.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point, and that's something that I've thought of, which is like it's easy to oust someone from office, but it's harder to kind of undo their reforms. And I think about like Pamela Price, right? One of her big things was that she, kind of wanted to fix this death penalty scandal that emerged when she was in office around like, people who were, pulled off juries, death penalty jury selection. They were, denied the ability to go on that jury because they were black or Jewish, and it was something that the prosecutor's office in Alameda County had done for decades. And that's not going away, and that's a scandal that involves like a federal judge. And I think there are things that have to be done there. And I also think that like, we've seen this in other places like Baltimore, like where it's not so easy to put the genie back in the bottle. You had somebody there, and I worked, full disclosure, for Marilyn Mosby, and we implemented the policy of non-prosecution of low-level offences, and then her opponent won campaigning to repeal that, and he's actually not been able to repeal it. He's done this kind of like half-assed ticketing court thing that doesn't actually work. And so you do see that it's like quite hard. I think you're right, there is a floor now on reform, and I think it's quite hard to go beneath that, even with, the repeal of, the law to kind of that would increase penalties for low-level offences. Like how that is going to be implemented is up for debate. It's obviously true that voters voted for like an increase in penalties, but how that's going to shake out is not exactly clear. And so I think that is a very good point, and we should really fight to make sure it's difficult for whoever takes over from Pamela Price to like repeal whoever takes over from, when George Gascon's successor takes office, like we should make sure that it's really difficult to repeal some of the the reforms and some of the good work that those folks have done.
Yeah, and that's a good point on Prop 36, because Prop 36 was not a full-on repeal of Prop 47. In fact, you could argue, and I did privately with people saying, hey, it might not even have a big effect, because where it was going to make a difference was going to be, oh, you have these repeat offenders in retail theft that could be charged with a felony. But and I made this point, for several months now. If you look at actual charging decisions on retail theft, most of it is felony. Because what is it? Well, it's organized retail theft, in which case it's a conspiracy, which can be charged as a felony. It's grand theft, which is charged as a felony, or it's robbery, which is charged as a felony. And there are very few cases, especially the ones that show up on these videos that people are really worried about, where they actually can't charge them as felonies because of state law. Like almost all of these things were actually charged as felonies. And so the idea that Prop 47 was preventing stuff from getting charged as a felony, and then there was this absurd notion that a misdemeanor is like a ticket, which my DA actually has pushed this idea that, oh, we're charging misdemeanors and that's like a ticket. I'm like, that's not a ticket. Yeah, you have to go to jail. You can face jail time. You can face community service. A ticket is like you get fined. I mean, I don't understand this stuff, but the rhetoric won out. But if you look at the actual policy is fairly modest, and it doesn't it's not going to make a huge difference.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think that speaks to like one of the challenges that we have as a movement, which is like people vote for and embrace for and buy into this kind of like, we're going to reduce crime and we're going to crack down and we're going to like make the streets safer. And I think it's really important for us to kind of hold people accountable. And, like I think about Brooke Jenkins in San Francisco and how, after Chaser left office, violent crime actually went up. And, we need to be talking about that. These people are not going to be able to keep their promises. These things that voters have been promised are not going to come true. We're not going to magically see, a drop in retail theft, or we're not going to magically see the streets of San Francisco or Oakland or wherever like completely free of crime. Like that's just not how it works. And, I think in some situations, it will probably get worse because of what's, these individuals are planning. And so, I just think it's important for us to hold people accountable. And I think it's been disappointing because the media certainly did like a million stories about Chaser and all the problems with Chaser and all the problems with Pam Price. We don't see that level of scrutiny when it comes to the more conservative leaning prosecutors. Like they don't get that level of scrutiny. And I think that is a problem we have in our media. That's a problem, in terms of narrative. But I also think that like folks on our side were so busy being on the defensive in so many places that it's hard to like focus and be on the offensive and call these people out for their BS.
So we're almost out of time, but I did want you to kind of lay out a few ideas that you have for moving forward with this. I mean, obviously, a big factor is simply getting better at the narrative game. But, from your perspective, what do we need to do in the next 2 years, 4 years?
Well, I think there has to be like a recognition that like, our issue isn't popular just now, and that's okay, right? And we'll come around again and we'll be ready, for the fight next time. But we have to be sort of safe in the knowledge that what we are doing is the right approach because of the fact that mass incarceration is the most pressing civil rights issue of our time. And, just voters might have rejected some of our solutions like progressive prosecutors for the time being, but that doesn't mean we're wrong. And I use that sort of George W. Bush analogy. There's things like Obamacare that were once deeply unpopular that then became popular again. And some issues get laughed at, like marijuana legalization, and then become mainstream. And so I think that we need to, be okay with the fact that our issue is unpopular just now, and also acknowledge that that's unlikely to last because we know that those solutions to public safety that are put forward by the right are not going to work. I think we also have to wrestle with this kind of contradiction among liberals and progressives that like they say they support our issues, but then when it comes down to it, especially on the implementation side, they actually don't, and they actually really reject what we are trying to do in some cases. I mentioned, people having the kind of Black Lives Matter and no more drug war signs, but also rejecting, drug treatment facilities and rejecting, any solutions that do not involve police. And that's something I don't really have the answer to that, but that's sort of like, one of the issues that I think we have to wrestle with. I also think one of our problems, I think our issues have become very closely associated with the Democratic Party, right? And I think even for some people on the reform side, the mainstream acceptance of our policies is almost like the objective. And I think one of the lessons from this election is that there's like a strong anti-establishment sentiment and that people are looking for radical solutions. And our movement is actually very radical, and we seek to kind of overhaul and rethink the justice system. We shouldn't be going to Democrats and looking for their approval. We need them to come to us, because I think that, by sanitizing our boldness, we've lost the support of our electorate, and we're actually, we're even shunned by mainstream Democrats anyway. So I think we need to rethink that strategy. And then the last thing I'll say, well, two things I'll say to end. One is what I said is like these results are a disaster, but the real disaster of this election cycle is the election of Donald Trump. But that presents an opportunity because, he's going to use his influence and power to increase mass incarceration. He's going to encourage authoritarian policing practices, extreme sentences, expanded use of the death penalty, and I think that will provoke the anger of liberal America. And I think reformers should be ready to, educate the politicians in public about, the dangers of mass incarceration, especially now that that system is overseen by Trump. And I think you'll see, because of Trump, like a backlash that will enable progressive policies to emerge, especially in sort of so-called blue states like California. And I think that was what happened in the first Trump term, when you had progressive prosecutors and police accountability really becoming far more mainstream. We don't know what those issues are going to be in the second term, but I'm sure there will be some issues that we can move. And then we touched on this a little bit, but the last thing I'll say is, we do have a role in protecting some of the wins that we've gained over the last few years, even amid the electoral losses. And I think, voters may have opted to increase penalties for low-level offences. We don't really know how that's going to be implemented. And, progressive prosecutors have been ousted in Oakland and Los Angeles, but we should make sure that undoing some of the reforms is not an easy task. And so, I think, in summing up, the election was a disaster for criminal justice reform, but it's not a death knell. And, we're going to have a period in the wilderness. We're going to feel unpopular. But, our cause is just. We're on the right side of history, and we just need to be ready to ride again.
All right. Well, that's all the time we have. Thanks, Michael, for sharing your thoughts.
Sure.
We've been talking with Michael Collins from Color of Change. We talked about the recall of Pamela Price. We've talked about the broader conversation on criminal justice reform. This has been Everyday Injustice. I'm your host, David Greenwald. Join us again next time for more tales from the injustice system.
Thank you to George Powell and Norman Mousequake Barrett for the use of our opening, Everyday Injustice. You can see more of George's music at www.justiceforgeorgepowell.com. That's Justice for George Powell, all one word, .com.